give a quick, overview of like what we're seeing as far as the threat landscape and kind of the overlap on AWS. I'm sure a lot of you folks have heard, about some of the security things, and there's not a single week that goes by where there's something that hasn't gone on that. And basically, one of the things that you know, she asked me to go through is, basically, just kind of talk about some of the stuff we're seeing. So I know my title is a little bit generic. I'm the manager of the SpecOps team over at Sumo Logic. I'll give you a quick intro, but these are kind of the topics that I wanted to cover with some of that stuff. If you have any questions or comments or want to get a copy of the slide deck, Patty's a great resource for that. I'll have her email at the end of it, and we'll paste that in chat. If anyone wants to reach out and talk more. But I also want to make sure that at the end we've got some time for Q&A. But really, the topics are pretty simple. I wanted to give some actual real world examples of compromises and things that I've seen inside of Amazon environments, where people have gotten hacked. And I wanted to kind of give some personas as far as that goes, just as far as that stuff goes. And then more importantly, like what kind of things you can do to proactively, either prevent this from happening altogether, or things that you can do to help find it quicker, and mitigate some of the impact on the Amazon side. So with that, Patty, do you want to kind of intro yourself for folks that don't know?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for that. And I think James, you sell yourself short. He's part of our special operations team and does a really, really great job, security focused. So just to kind of at a high level, who we are, Sumo Logic is a cloud-based machine data analytics company, and we focus on security operations and business use cases. And myself personally, my role, I'm the account executive and I cover the Huntsville market, specifically the entire state of Alabama. And we collaborate and work really well with AWS. We were just recently announced to be their security multi-cloud hybrid threat protection. That was a collaboration that went out earlier this month that we're really proud of. And we can certainly talk through how we can assist with any of your questions as you're making that digital transformation, if you will. We noticed that it's accelerated over the past couple of years or so, and we're here to sort of help with any of the issues or challenges that come around that. So I'll hand that back over to you. He's the expert, you guys. If you have any questions related to how we can discuss this in more detail, feel free to reach out to me, but James is the subject matter expert on this. So I'll hand it over to him.
So I think one thing that Patty also might sell the company short a little bit on is just the massive amounts of volume of data that we see. So we do a lot of stuff on the observability side, but we also do a lot of things on the security side. So I know this is kind of a cliche thing, but there's some commercials where it's like, we've seen a thing or two, so we know a thing or two. Or I might have totally butchered that, but we collect a massive amount of telemetry every single day. So some of the more recent, some of the older things is we're collecting like hundreds and hundreds of petabytes of log telemetry and things like that. And that's kind of where me as a subject matter expert, I've got a lot of experience in that. So that's why things are relevant. I'm not trying to sell a product here or anything like that. I'm just trying to show some observations that we've seen in our data, as well as, working with different customer sides. So a bit more about me on the security side. I've been doing this for a long time. I've got background in the defense industrial base. So I've done a lot of work in the government. I've worked at a number of different vendors. I worked at startups, all sorts of different types of companies. So I've done security, both in tiny little environments and massive, corporations. I've done on-prem stuff. I've done AWS stuff. And, over the years, I've done, I'm not even joking you, probably thousands of investigations as far as compromised or hacked customers, environments, things like that. And I've worked on both sides of the fence. So I've been a customer where I've like used security things or been worried about instrumenting security from that standpoint. And then I've also done it on the vendor side. So I kind of have a bit of a viewpoint from both sides, and I jokingly tell people a lot of times like get off my lawn, stuff like that. I'm kind of a bitter old security guy, but I still love it, and things like that. So today I wanted to give you some actual real world examples of compromises that I've seen inside of AWS environments. And the important thing to note here is while there might have been compromises in the AWS environment, like in these customer environments, it in no way is the fault of AWS. Like in many of these cases, we'll go through this a little bit longer, but like many of these cases, something could have changed. A customer could have configured something differently, or they could have been monitoring some sort of security, feature or things like that. And these attacks could have been mitigated. I like to tell people, back in the day, like when clouds were first coming out, there were a lot of hidden dangers. And a lot of those things have become much more difficult to do, but you still need to be vigilant, on that stuff. If you intentionally configure something poorly, or you set something up, you're going to be setting yourself up for failure. And it's true both on the development side, when you're developing apps with regard to like Amazon, specific functions, like if you're doing, Lambda functions or things like that, if you intentionally set it up in an insecure manner, it's going to be insecure, but it's the same thing as well with the infrastructure. So for example, if you go through and set some sort of, infrastructure up and you do it in such an insecure way, you're going to have a really bad day. So I have these three examples. I'm going to talk through, just kind of the first one. So long story short, there was a group and I talk about it like as if it's one person, but the truth is, I don't know how many people were behind this. I can tell you that this is likely to have been a coordinated effort. There were probably multiple people, and there were probably even things where they were purchasing services from third parties, or things like that. But basically, during an investigation, I was working with a customer, and we were going through and basically going, why did they compromise their AWS account? And we were trying to figure out like what exactly had happened, why this data had leaked, and things like that. And basically what we started noticing was this pattern of compromises. And basically they had gone after a number of different service providers, that were providing different types of services to customers where they had lots of users, inside these accounts. And basically what was happening is an attacker would steal an account, whether it be, some sort of API key that they were able to pull from like a developer's, laptop, from a Git repository, some sort of source code repo, or they were finding accounts that had console access into AWS through other compromise. And basically what they would do is then they would do things like pulling down their RDS instances, so their relational database systems where, a lot of, if the company was like a service provider, they were storing user accounts in that. And what they would do is they would pull those databases down. And then basically once they had them, even though the passwords were encrypted, they were salted and hashed, at this point in time, there's so many compute resources available to most people that it's just how important are those passwords. You can basically brute force those offline and crack them at your own, leisure. And that's what they were doing, is basically they would pull these databases down. I don't have direct evidence. I just saw the end results of these, but basically they'd compromise an account, they'd pull a database in, and then later on, what they would do is they would use the credentials, from those stolen databases and try to log into other services. So, we saw one customer where the database, was pulled down. It just so happened there was let's call that customer A. There was then, and this is from a different job, but then there was customer B who happened to use that service. And they had a developer account in customer A's data set. And basically they pulled it down, compromised the passwords, and then they were able to basically pivot over into customer B's environment. One of the things that we thought, on this particular use case was they were basically there was two things that they were trying to do. So one was they were using these credentials to log into different crypto sites. So basically, you'd go to a crypto exchange or something like that, and they would basically compromise those accounts so that they could steal cryptocurrency. So that was one of the main things. But then we also would see, later on, a lot of these same databases end up being sold on user credential marketplaces. And for those who aren't aware, there's entire underground marketplaces where all they do is sell valid usernames and passwords to different services that have already been tested. So you can go out and buy some of these things. And unfortunately, like some of those services are why you see some of these ransomware attacks, is basically like there's legitimate credentials that they're able to use those and then further other attacks. So we've seen those types of things, where we believe that those are from those types of marketplaces. And really the key takeaway on this, crypto thief compromise is they were using a bunch of different tactics, same group, bunch of different tactics. So like they would use stolen keys, where they were checked into, let's say like a GitLab repo or something like that. They would find those and then basically use those to log in. We saw them, pulling other credentials like through AWS console accounts, things like that. And then they'd basically get in and start doing lots of, enumeration, pivoting, pulling data, things like that. Like they'd look at S3 buckets, they'd look at, RDS instances, all sorts of stuff. So they would basically get into an account and then they would look like everywhere for more things that they could use. So that's the crypto thief. That's my story on that. Sorry, it's kind of a little bit meandering, but real world example of that. The other interesting one, is where people are very opportunistic. I've seen. I was doing an investigation. And basically, we were able to piece together a few things on it. So an attacker found an S3 backup of one of the WordPress sites that a company was using for like some marketing thing. And basically, what they did is they were able to pull the database off of that. They then offline cracked the passwords for that WordPress instance, and then basically what they did is once they had admin on the WordPress site, and the funny thing is the WordPress site was actually like running in a container on a host, and the folks were like, why did this happen? Like we had all this isolated. Well, what they didn't know was there was some like token services that were accessible from the WordPress site. And they were very overprivileged as far as the tokens go. So as soon as they got onto the WordPress site, they were able to start issuing commands on the token service. And then basically they pulled in an admin account through, like an IAM, a Sumo role. And then basically from there, then they were able to compromise that whole AWS account. So it's really important, when we talk about security that, you might think to yourself like, well, my WordPress site is isolated. it's in a Docker container, and the database is behind everything. There's nothing important on that, things like that. And it's like, if there's one little thing that's wrong, or messed up on those things, if you can really be suffering on those types of things. And then, so the very last example, of an investigation that I've seen, I call this the anarchist, but really this is kind of more just like your typical ransomware, type of thing, but a little bit of an AWS twist. They had compromised a AWS account. They had stolen credentials where the developer was reusing those credentials, on different websites. Um, and basically, sorry, that was incorrect. On this particular one, the developer workstation was compromised. They were able to get his credentials from the developer workstation, and then they were able to log on to their AWS environment. And basically, because the developer got infected with just like a Trojan, like a information stealer, type of, run-of-the-mill malware, that entire Amazon environment got compromised, because they weren't protecting the endpoint. And had they had logs like, a new IP is logged on, or an IP from Poland when the developer was in the US has logged on, those types of things could have prevented or immediately helped them identify and remediate some of these issues. So one of the common things you'll see from me, on the security topic, is visibility. Like having visibility into the security side is hyper critical, to having any sort of success, from that standpoint. Because basically all of these stories, there's one common thing. The customer didn't have enough visibility to understand that these attacks were taking place, behind the scenes. Most of these customers, or folks that I've seen, on these examples, this is over the course of my career at a bunch of different places, but most of them didn't know what was going on for days, weeks, or even months, that this stuff was happening. And lastly, there's some few things that could have prevented these. Like, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but it was many small things that contributed towards the compromise. And had they changed like one little thing here or one little thing there, it's entirely possible that some of these larger attacks wouldn't have happened, or at least it would have been more difficult, for the attacker to do stuff. So those are just some examples of things that I've seen, real life. And what is really interesting to me, I also I find it interesting, like some of the real life examples. The FAA has this history called, or this phrase, and they call it a culture of safety. And basically, one of the things that they do is when they do investigations, into plane crashes or things like that, they try to figure out like why these things happened. And sometimes there will be things like maintenance issues, or sometimes there will be, the pilots ignored this warning lamp because, maintenance hadn't done anything on it. And really what the common theme you see in that stuff is people get desensitized, to some of these things, and then they start ignoring these safety, critical things. So that's why, like, when you see in real life, like FAA, they try to push things towards, actually addressing these things and like building that culture of safety. We have the same problem on the information security side, where you have to push this as a cultural thing. So, for example, with the FAA side of things, when terrain warning system, which is basically those warnings that you hear sometimes that it goes pull up, what was happening was they were alerting all the time. And basically, there was a couple, plane accidents, and one of the contributing factors of that was the pilots had become so desensitized to those alerts that they basically ignored them. So one of the findings that they had on that was, hey, we should remove as many false positives so these things only alert when there are actual, actionable things. Like when it says pull up, the pilot needs to immediately take action and pull up. And these are warning systems that are built into, these planes that should be like that. We have the exact same thing, in AWS and some of those things. When you have a warning that says somebody logged in from another country or something like that, boom, there should be some sort of immediate action, that's taken. And honestly, it's one of these things where it requires a lot of effort, on that, where if that alert doesn't mean anything, then it needs to be fixed. Like the alert itself needs to be fixed and tuned down to a point where you're getting good things. And that's just kind of one of the common themes that we see a lot of is people, they just get fatigued by all the things that are happening and things like that. So that's one of the things that I observe a lot, inside of folks' environments, it's definitely something to think of when you're thinking about AWS and security and things like that. The other thing, if I'm being blunt, logging is going to save your butt. I mean, it's going to save your bacon at some point. Things like CloudTrail, CloudWatch, some people, they're very casual about it. And it is one of those things where if there's one takeaway, for everyone, who's either watching this or observing this, it is take a look at your logging systems, see what you're pulling in, our stuff, is there things disabled that shouldn't be, stuff like that. Because once you get into a point where you are in a compromised situation, this stuff is worth its weight in gold. You can't ever look and go through logs that you don't actually store. So that's why it's really, really important to go through and do that stuff. Save it, in a separate account, if you can do that. One of the things that I would recommend for a lot of folks is like having a separate account that they can, basically really lock down, and then being able to copy those logs into those accounts, or having some sort of admin account where, even if an attacker gets access to an account, they can't go through and delete those and purge those logs. And that's also another thing that, when we talk about policies, for some of the stuff, it's amazing how many of the basic logging policies and alerts will actually like immediately, trigger in some of these compromises. So, I mean, things like, there's your admin stuff where it's like, making sure that your standard security things are taking place. But I mean, alerting on something where it's like, an inbound security group that's accepting all access, from the internet. Like those are important things. Is there a new API key that was added with, full IAM permissions? Those are extremement important things. Are there, privileged tokens that are basically, way over permissioned, on things like that? And then also things like, a lot of people have these break glass accounts, which are just, secondary accounts that can always log in. Have those been touched? Have they been logged into? Stuff like that. Those are extremely useful things that you can do. And then more importantly, doing something with some of those alerts. So like, I've worked in a bunch of different places where we've set up things like Lambda functions, to actually do the alerting side of things, or even to do like advanced filtering, or things of that nature. Getting those in front of somebody and actually looking at those are extremely useful. And lastly, one of the other important things that I'll say is, don't take it for granted that the internet is super dangerous. A few years ago, I ran an experiment, with a customer, and basically we set up an S3 bucket where it was like the company name, dash, or underscore finance or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the bucket name was, but basically, like within 24 hours, I had hits, for accessing like CSV files in those buckets like hundreds of times. The way that people find these buckets, there's a bunch of different ways that people do it, but don't take for granted that, oh, it's just an obscure thing, or why would anyone need access to this data? Why would anyone, want to look at that, or things like that. Trust me when I say this, there are automation tools all over the place that are constantly looking for these misconfigurations. They're trying to take advantage of that stuff. There's automated tools that are looking for like SQL backups, for any sort of, hashed user accounts, CSVs, credit cards, all sorts of stuff. So just be hyper aware that even if you think that nobody would ever hit it, I can almost guarantee you there's somebody scanning for that type of data. I've set up honeypots, where it's basically like a fake service, inside of AWS environments, inside, certain customer environments and things like that. And it's like minutes before these things start getting traffic to them on certain things. So, things like Redis, like Memcache, you'd think, well, who wants to hit, a memory cache, on the internet? And it's like, well, those have got session IDs, which then they can use to pivot into an application, or maybe there's, cache credentials or emails or things like that. And just don't do it. Like, isolate the stuff, create rules, wherever you can to alert you on these types of misconfigurations, and go from there. The other thing that I see almost every single day is account takeovers. You might hear it as ATOs, password spraying, stuff like that. But really, the important thing for developers, even as you're developing applications, is take this into account. Like, your users will probably reuse passwords from other websites. And so being able to integrate with APIs for like not allowing known compromised passwords, it's going to save a lot of pain for your users to do that stuff. And then also things like, authenticating, browsers, like dropping a cookie on a browser. And then basically, anytime that, that browser hasn't been seen, verifying that that's the user, you can save so much pain for your users and things like that. And there's just so many different ways that you can actually, go through and help things along those lines. So I guess the major takeaways from this conversation is enable logging. If you don't know what's going on, you're never ever going to be able to respond to a security incident. Like, logging is so critical to understanding what's happened after the fact. Two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, just do it. Like, force it on your organization. If you're an application developer or something like that, get it in your app. Things like YubiKeys, the FIDO standard for multi-factor, physical tokens, things like that. They're very easy to implement these days. There's tons of libraries out there. There's also sort of, great resources when it comes to actually implementing those. And then also things like OAuth and things like that. There's so many great resources these days that it's pretty much like table stakes. Like, get that stuff, not only in your AWS accounts, but also in your application accounts if you're an app dev, or something like that. The other thing that I recommend to folks all the time is figure out a strategy for managing your secrets. It's 2021, guys. Managing secrets and like manually rolling API keys, that's just not what you should be doing in 2021. Like figure out a strategy, whether it's something built into your cloud provider. There are secret management systems, for dealing with that stuff. Or you're using something like HashiCorp, Vault or something like that. It doesn't really matter, but doing some sort of secret management and having some sort of strategy on that is absolutely critical, because then it allows you to roll those things immediately. If you're worried about, a developer that had malware on his box, roll the freaking keys. It doesn't matter. Like, if you have a secret management system that actually works and has been tested, you're talking about 30 seconds, before you can roll that stuff. And it just makes life so much nicer. The other thing is less privileges are always better. So, minimize your access and the types of things that you can do, especially in some of these IAM roles. I generally recommend folks, wherever they can, like don't give developers full admin access. If they need to do some sort of thing in S3, like create a bucket, like, if you've got a secret manager and some sort of system that you can actually rely on, cut them a key to do that. Or even better, if you have the resources, help build out tooling to do these common use cases for your developers. And then you're just going to have a much more standardized, secure environment. Those are the types of things that I would recommend. And with that, I could go into some of the stuff like how we hunt, but I do want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. So, with that, I'm not sure if there was some other stuff, Steve, if you had any questions or we wanted to go through any other subjects, I can go into some details on that stuff. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
as far as time goes, what everything looks like.
So I would say this is part of our interactive portion of the conversation, you guys. As I think James sort of sold himself short, he's worked for some really, really great high-level 3-letter agencies and has a lot of expertise, and he can certainly filter some questions for you. So please feel free. This is the Q&A portion of it, and he'll answer the questions that you have around best practices as it relates to security and cloud security explicitly. So ask away. Any questions? I'm going to check the chat. Okay.
Patty, this is Karn. I didn't have any questions. I just wanted to emphasize what James had mentioned on the call about the importance of having a separate email for security logins. And I just wanted to kind of note that into the group that when AWS works with particular customers on setting up an account and a control tower, we actually create some of these accounts with the customer. So if anyone needs help around that, just let me know and I'll get my solutions architect to help out.
Great. Do we have any questions from the team for James?
And Karna, maybe just to highlight a little bit more while we wait for if there's other questions. I'm not sure, like from a AWS standpoint, but a lot of times I basically see, one of 2 or 3 different types of patterns emerge with the way that people manage accounts. The most, I would say, basic pattern, which is like, in my mind, from a security standpoint, one of the worst things you can do is having like one giant account. And the other pattern that I see commonly is where it's set up for like applications, and then the third pattern that I see is where it's like organization specific things. Is there any comments, or any thoughts that you have on that as well?
Yeah, those are all great points. We do some best practices when we're setting up the accounts, because actually when you set them up, it takes about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour to populate an account number. So during that time, we, just like you mentioned, look for ways to not mimic, certain, I guess, flaws that we've seen, and just what you mentioned.
And I will say, like, with some of the account related stuff, um, it is, it, I can't emphasize like how having like separate accounts can help minimize the impact from a security standpoint. Like if somebody ever gets into there, and then also, from like a billing and cost standpoint, like a lot of times you can apply, restrictions on that, stuff like that, which really help. So Daryl had a question on, and sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Karna. Was there other stuff that you wanted to mention on that?
No, and Daryl brings up a good point. I think that will dovetail well to what I think you're about to talk about.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so with the APIs, so Daryl's question was, with the prevalence of APIs, besides avoiding hard coding keys, like what other security best practices can companies implement? It just depends on the type of API. So with something like Amazon, they have pretty extensive abilities to manage and cut API keys. So one of the common things that I see people do is, for example, with HashiCorp Vault, a lot of organizations that I've worked with, they'll use something like HashiCorp Vault, where they'll use that as a broker for cutting API keys. And what they will do is they will implement their business logic for permissions, things like that inside of the Vault system. And basically what will happen is a developer will authenticate to their, like I'll give an example with HashiVault. They'll authenticate to the HashiVault. They might have to enter a multi-factor authentication. And then what will happen is that will take care of generating an API key for the permissions that they have. So a lot of times what a developer can do is they can issue, a request to the Vault and say, hey, I would like an API key to create an S3 bucket in this organization account. And then what takes care of that on the back end is, like HashiCorp Vault will, cut that out and then basically, give them an API key that's limited to those permissions that they can use for like, 30 minutes. And basically what will happen is that API key will expire out after a certain period of time. What becomes really problematic is when you're using, like applications that aren't as flexible like that. So, when it comes to using, there's a million different web apps out there. So my recommendation is, even if your the web app doesn't support that rich, authentication and things like that, still use some sort of secret manager, because then you can recut those keys. And then if you've got an application or developers, their workflow is to basically talk to your secret manager to get an API key, which means that you can change those API keys out more frequently. Like I've seen people where they use an admin interface to basically like, regenerate API keys like every 30 minutes, so that they're constantly rotating, and things like that. So that would be my recommendation as far as that goes. The other recommendation from like a API security standpoint, if you develop an API, so many people do not log API requests. Log the API requests, store those, because there are tons of bad actors, and one of the common things that they will do is they will abuse those APIs to pull data. And if you are not instrumented well in your APIs, like if you're developing an application and you're developing APIs, then you're going to have a giant blind spot for visibility on that. So hopefully that answered your question, Daryl. Yeah. And then I'm not sure if there's other stuff that folks want to talk to. And if not, I think I'm going to hand it over to Steve if there's no more questions.